Feeling lost is universal. And being found can feel impossible. But on this podcast, we think following your passions just might be the key to finding your purpose and to finding who you are. Welcome to Lost and Found. Okay, and welcome everybody to Lost and Found. This is a new podcast where we try to delve into kind of the experiences and lives of folks who have followed their interests and passions to create fulfilling lifestyles, whether that's through following their passions to create careers for themselves that span a lifetime, or even just side jobs, or even just hobbies, anything like that kind of brings a sense of fulfillment to your life. So we are speaking with one of those folks today, Ross Wissing, all the way from Australia, which is pretty awesome. So thank you, Ross, for joining me today. How are you doing?
Yeah, really well, thanks, Justine. My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I thought we'd just kind of start off with, if you could give yourself a little bit of an introduction. I think it's always
Cool.
best coming from the source. So yeah, without further ado, go ahead.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justine. So who am I in terms of professionally and personally? Well, I guess firstly, I'm a father of two 18-year-old boys. I live in Geelong, which for those of you who don't know, and I'm assuming that it'll be most, given that it's an American audience, or predominantly American audience, it's the second major city in Victoria behind Melbourne, which I'm sure most people would have heard about. It's about an hour down the road, so it's pretty close by. I grew up in Geelong, escaped to go to uni and to work, and then came back in my early 30s and have been there since. Professionally, I began my career as a horticulturalist and then did some work in environmental management, and then did a master's in landscape architecture and a PhD in architecture and built environment. So my career has largely been around the built environment and, I guess, the broader natural environment sort of areas.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So you would then, I guess, describe yourself as mostly, would you say, a sustainable landscape architect, or is that how you would describe yourself right now?
Yeah. It's interesting in terms of, well, I guess partly it depends on audience and context, but generally I would describe myself in that terms.
Mhm. So if you don't mind, like, what, I guess, led you down this road? Do you have a memory, an initial memory of, I guess, realizing that you wanted to at least go into horticulture? Because you mentioned that you initially went into horticulture.
Mm, mm. Um, yeah, it is interesting. I guess from as long as I can remember, I was always interested in the outdoors and in the environment. Um, and one of, I guess, the earliest memories I have is my grandfather owned a caravan park down on the Ballarat Peninsula, which is about half an hour away, and we used to spend the weekends down there helping him manage the park. And one day, apparently, I disappeared, and I must have been. The story is I was around about 2, and my father and grandfather couldn't find me, and so they're wondering where I am. And
Mhm.
after, I don't know, half an hour or an hour of exploring, they finally find me, and it's in the middle of winter, and there was a big wetland next to my grandfather's caravan park, and I was up to my chest in water, walking in the wetland. And so, even from those sort of ages, and even looking, back at family photos and that sort of stuff, one of the earliest photos again is of me sitting in what's called a gully trap here, which is where all the hot water from washing machines comes out and goes into
Mhm.
the drain. And so, the photos of me underneath this stream well, it must have been because it was hot water. Um, but I was always immersed in water. And then I guess my grandfather, who I talked about before, he grew up on, I guess you'd say, a small farm in Melbourne. And that small farm was an orchard and also produced vegetables and had chickens. So that this would have been the early sort of 20th century. And so he used to come to my parents' house, and he'd be pruning fruit trees and planting vegetables. And so from from that stage on, like I was just always sort of attracted to it. And then I guess the older that I got sort of, when I was sort of 10 and onwards, and then going into teenage years, in those days, your parents used to kick you out of home as soon as you got home from school, and don't come back until it's dark or until the street lights are on. So it was just normal
Mm.
for, well, not just me, but pretty much every kid to go down to the creek or go up to the railway line and build tree houses and all that sort of stuff. So it was just always inbuilt. And then in Australia, when you get to year 10, so you sort of, I don't know, 14, 15, you have to do a couple of weeks of work experience. And so um, went into the career counsellor and sort of talked about options. And one of them was working in the local nursery. And so um, that was sort of my first professional exposure to horticulture.
Mm.
And I was interested in that, but I was also interested in spending time, I guess, in wild nature, so things like national parks and those sorts of things. And so then did some further work experience the next year, I think it was, in a regional park. So not quite a national park, but
Mm.
a nature reserve. And I guess that sort of led me to mainly being interested in being a park ranger. But
Mm.
when I went to uni, there weren't many sort of options in terms of environmental related courses, or even for being a park ranger. So the options were horticulture, it was forestry, and landscape architecture.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so, yeah, basically because, well, I sort of look back on it now, and I look back at the more I sort of delve into my family history, the more I see that there's been a long line of people who have worked the land and have worked in orchards and vegetable farming and all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
Uh, so yeah, decided to do horticulture, and there were, I guess, a couple of routes that were available in horticulture. There was very much the ornamental, so plant production, and then I guess ornamental gardens. But when I was there, I went to Burnley, which is probably the oldest horticultural institution in Australia, and it had been, I guess, quite staid for some time, and probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years before a couple of young British academics came over, and one of them was James Hitchmore, who, after his time in Australia, went back to the UK and ultimately led the landscape school at University of Sheffield for, I don't know, probably 20 years or so.
Mm.
And James was really interested in, um, I guess, environmental or ecological horticulture. Um,
Mhm.
and so one of the things that he's particularly interested in was grasslands
Mhm.
and basalt plains grasslands. And that was something that, through work at Geelong Indigenous Nursery in plant production and those sorts of things, that I was also interested in. So that really led me into horticulture, and I guess the first part of my career, which is around ecological restoration.
Mhm. I find it interesting that you mentioned that, you kind of grew up, you know, just kind of having nature as part of your life, part of your family's life. So it does kind of beg the question, um, did there ever seem like there was even another path, or was it always just in your mind? Was it always something that had to do with plants?
No, there was another path. So my family had a tailoring and a menswear business, and it had operated for, I don't know, it operated for over 60 years or so, and so I was the oldest grandchild
Mm,
and the third generation. And so I was earmarked, particularly
mm,
by my grandparents from a very young age to take over that business. And
wow.
I used to work in it when I was a young kid and, in the shop, and I just hated it. And
Yeah.
so, from an early up, from sort of mid-teens onwards, the time that I was doing work experience and those sorts of things, um, yeah, I just had a really strong, it wasn't even a conscious conviction, to work in an area that I was interested in. It sort of comes back to what we were sort of talking about before we started recording.
Mhm.
Um, I'd seen that my father had worked in that business for 40 years and wasn't happy. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um, family businesses can be pretty difficult entities to navigate,
Yeah.
to work and to live in. And it was something that I didn't want to do. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I don't know what it was. I guess I was also lucky in terms of timing that the tertiary, um, I guess, industry in Australia is less advanced, or certainly less advanced than what it is in America. So it was really only from the early 80s that there was a really concerted push from the Commonwealth government to get, more young people, um, to go to university, and I was sort of 10 years after that. So I guess options opened that weren't available to my father, or to even people who are 20 years younger than me and the like. So part of it was just opportunity. Part of it was, yeah, I just had this strong desire to work in the environmental field.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely, you hear about people who have these family-owned businesses, and you can just imagine that those who run it um, really do want it to continue through the
Mm,
generations. And so once you have this child who, like in your position, the oldest, well, you gotta, sorry, this is
mm,
kind of your life now.
mm,
That kind of pressure is probably very hard for a lot of people who are in that same position as you. And I think that a lot of times, people who are in that kind of position probably do feel a sense of you know well, I guess I have no choice. And so it's interesting to me that you managed to kind of go down your own path anyway. Can I
mm.
ask, were there, I guess, was your family fine with that, or was there any pushback?
Um, Not sort of overt pushback, but yeah, I think that there's always been, um, yeah, some reluctance,
Mhm.
that I've sort of gone down that path.
Yeah.
And I think part of that probably relates a little bit, if I'm talking about my father, for example, to regret, that he didn't want to work in that business. He did it partly out of obligation. He would have
Yeah.
liked to have done other sorts of things. For whatever reason, he didn't go down that path.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd seen the negative side of family businesses, and it was just something that I didn't want to spend the rest of my career doing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, and I was lucky that, as I said before, I had some opportunities to go to university, and even though those opportunities, in terms of the sorts of things that you could do at the time, um, were limited, it was still, an opportunity that gave me the ability to explore what ultimately I'm really passionate about, most passionate about.
Mhm. Did you get any pushback for the field that you chose to be in? Like, because I would imagine, over here in America, I think now doing jobs that have to do with nature and sustainability and all that stuff, going into that line of work is kind of now becoming very popular and accepted and stuff. But I would imagine just a few decades ago, if somebody said, "Oh yeah, I wanna go into being, a park ranger or something like that parents might be like, "Where's the money in that? What are you doing?" Stuff like that. At least over here. I don't know how it is over there. Like, did you get any
Yeah.
pushback like that?
No, not really. I mean,
Mhm.
because particularly my mother's side of the family had that really strong connection with orchards, and
Yeah.
like we're even talk. So I've been looking more and more sort of into ancestry, and so the first generation of people who came out from my mother's side in the 1840s, so just after Melbourne was settled. Um, they were orchardists
Mm,
and food producers. Um, and there's a sort of a bit of a lineage, as I was sort of saying before, with my grandfather. So I think that there was that was okay, and because it was horticulture at that time, environmental horticulture was only really just emerging, and I wasn't overly sort of familiar with it when I started. So that there weren't those sorts of pressures, but also too, I remember particularly in the first decade that I was working, anyone who had any tertiary qualification,
mm,
and who was working in the environment field had actually gone to Burnley and had done
mm,
horticulture. So it was the de facto sort of environmental qualification. Like I was saying
mm,
before, there was forestry, which was generally where, if you want to be a park ranger, that's what you went and did. And sure, looking after forestry estates is one part of it, but it's only a small part, of what park rangers do. And
mm,
then landscape architecture had only really emerged in a decade or so before.
mhm,
So the options were pretty limited, and I think probably more from a societal perspective, there was, in terms of generational sorts of things, um, it was probably more, I don't know, reluctance is the right word, but older generation saying, well, why do you actually need to go to university? I did an apprenticeship, or you learnt on the job. So there was probably more that sort of questioning, rather than questioning of, well, what exactly are you doing? What course are you doing, and why?
mm. So when you were, I guess, going through the beginnings of this path into landscape architecture and all of that, what was that like? I suppose, like, did you come across any obstacles that at any point made you kind of question your own desire to be in this field?
Um, Not so much question my desire to be in the field, but which part of the field that I
Mhm,
was in. So, as I mentioned before, like my first job was working for Bowen Water, which is a water authority um, in Geelong, and they were doing a lot of revegetation of the Bowen River. So, bring back the indigenous vegetation, so recreating wetlands and grasslands and riparian areas, and all that sort of stuff. And I did that, I don't know, for a year and a half or so, and then was offered the opportunity to manage a program called Water Watch, which is a community water monitoring program. So it worked with school kids, it worked with farmers out in the rural areas, and tried to work with urban residents to monitor the health of waterways. And
mhm,
once you'd found what the condition was in, which is generally not great, um, then we established a community nursery to basically grow indigenous plants, and then particularly adult communities could grow those plants and plant them out on their farms or in urban areas and improve water quality and that sort of stuff. And I did that for, I don't know, 3.5 or 4 years, and I got to the point where I was ready to go overseas, and I was sort of winding down to go and do that. And then I got asked to manage the state program in South Australia, which is the state over from Victoria, and family and work colleagues who were a bit older than, or in some cases a lot older than me, said, "Oh, it's a really good opportunity. You should go and do it."
Mhm.
And so I went and did it, and sort of did it a little bit reluctantly because I felt like I just needed a break.
Mm.
Um, and then, so on one hand, it's like, well, here's a really good opportunity. And that was sort of a baptism of fire because I was pretty young. Um, South Australia is a small state, and they've sort of got a little brother, big brother relationship with Victoria. And so,
Mm.
here's someone young from Victoria, coming over to manage our program. Um, and so that was pretty tough.
Mm.
Because there'd been a fair few sort of cultural problems in the program before I came over, and that was one of the reasons they wanted someone not from South Australia to come in. So certainly, during that period, there were quite a few times where I just thought, "Why am I doing this? I could be overseas. I
Mm.
could be on a working holiday. I could be, you know, traveling and doing all that sort of stuff." And yeah, just managed to stick it out.
Mhm.
And then, towards the end of that contract, I was offered another promotion, and it was sort of like, by this stage I would have been 28. Um, and at that point, Australia used to be able to get working holiday visas in the UK, but you had to be 28. You couldn't be any older than that. So it was like
Mm.
this sort of big weighing up point of, well, what do I really want to do?
Mm.
And it was just like, no, like I need to go and travel. And that
Mhm.
that was really important because it gave me at least a year to actually stop and to think about what I actually wanted to do.
Mhm.
And so then I came back to Geelong because I'd been working interstate and overseas after that, and started working with local land care groups, so local farmer groups for the Regional Catchment Management Authority. And that's where I thought that I'd you know, um, be working for the next while. And then I got tapped on the shoulder to manage Water Watch at the national level. So this is up in
Mm.
Canberra. And, because I'd worked in Water Watch by that stage for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years. And um, it was a time where, so Water Watch used to get funded nationally. And it was going from one funding bucket or one funding era to another funding era. And
Mhm.
so I sort of thought, well, because I'd had, the experience in Water Watch, it was a good opportunity to sort of make sure that Water Watch continued because, it was and still is quite unique, and it was the only national community water monitoring program in the world. Like we had 50,000 volunteers going out to their local creeks and waterways and monitoring. And I think Australia's population at that stage would have been, I don't know, 20 million or so. So it was a lot of people. So I went up there and and did that and worked in the Commonwealth for a while. But at the end of that, looking back, I was just really burnt out, and I just
Yeah.
decided that you know I was working in the environment field, but I was in increasingly senior managerial positions,
Mm.
and that was just something that I didn't particularly want to do.
Yeah.
So that was when I then came back and started studying landscape architecture.
Mhm. So so you mentioned that you kind of had these two options to it was either to be promoted, I believe, in one of your roles, or to go off and kind of travel for a
Mm.
year and do the working visa, right? So if you hadn't decided to do that, how do you think everything would have panned out?
Um, I might have even left the environment field, I think, because
Um,
I really needed that break, and I needed just some clear space to sit down and, because I was quite successful in my career, but I was also, it was really stressful. I was working long hours.
yeah.
The career was all I was doing. I was,
Mm.
away from home. Um, it took a lot of effort to establish, social connections and that sort of stuff, particularly
Mhm.
when you're working a long time. And it was just like, do I really want to do that? And so
Yeah.
being able to backpack, you've got the antithesis of that where you got lots of time, not
Yeah.
often a lot of money. But also, I went and did exactly what I wanted to do, which was really important. So I went and visited lots of landscapes, through Europe and through the Middle East and India and Nepal and places like that. So I guess that was also a real inspiration, for what I wanted to do, which was more about sort of the designer stuff. So
Yeah.
horticulture was much more about, well, how do you actually grow this stuff? How do you plant it? What are the right plants? How do you maintain it?
Mhm.
And that's been fundamental in terms of, my practice as a landscape architect and more broadly in sustainable landscapes. Um, but yeah, I just needed that sort of circuit breaker and the time to just, yeah, really work out what I wanted. I guess at that point, the rest of my career to be, because it was either, you get fast tracked into senior positions in government, and some people really like that.
Mhm.
Um, but for me, I'd much rather sort of operate a few rungs below, sort of at the interface between theory and practice, and I couldn't do that at those levels.
Mhm. Yeah. It's fascinating because I think going into something, environmental, like an environmental field is what people have, as an idea to kind of get out of that cycle, to get out of the cycle of, okay, I start a job, next year I get promoted to the next level, the next year I get promoted to the next level, and then I'm like up high, but I'm in an office and I'm just kind of managing everybody and I'm
Mm,
I'm not really doing anything myself. I'm just kind of taking care of what everybody else does and
mm,
all that kind of stuff and delegating and all that stuff. And I feel like people go into sometimes people go into
mm,
environmental fields to escape that. So it's interesting that you were in an environmental field anyway and that still happened to you. But
yeah,
it's I mean it's obviously for you it's a good thing that you had the I guess the wherewithal and just the I guess courage to take that step back. So
yeah,
that kind of brings me to another question of how like how do you have that courage to be like, wait a second, let me actually listen to myself because I think a lot of times people have trouble doing that. A lot of people could have found themselves in your position and said, well, maybe I'll just stick it through and stick it out and see like what happens and yeah, sure, I'll get promoted to like, this higher level and I'm going to be in the office, but let me just do that for a little bit just to see where it goes and like, like pile up some like a lot of savings because I'm sure as you get higher, the paycheck probably gets higher, all that stuff.
mm.
So what was inside of you that was able to fight that and listen to yourself?
Um, well, I think part of it comes back to what we were talking about before about, family upbringing and being in a business,
Yeah,
and seeing firsthand, I guess, the impacts that, being in jobs that you don't like
yeah,
and not having the courage to actually leave and
yeah,
to follow what you're interested in. Um, but then just wasn't happy, you know,
yeah,
like, um, I was doing really well career-wise, but I didn't have the time to do a lot of the other things that I guess now I reflect on that, bring me a lot of joy um, and that I like doing.
mhm,
So, part of it was just that strong sense of, well, I'm not enjoying it. And if I'm
yeah,
not enjoying it, then I need to find, like, because I would have been, I don't know, probably 30 or so at that stage, maybe a little bit older. Australians can't retire until they're 67. So it's
mm,
like, do I want to be spending the next 35 years of my life working like this?
yeah,
And the short answer was that I didn't. So if I don't want to do it, and like I was saying before, having the opportunity to travel, and waiting so long to do that, that gave me the clear space to go, well, this is actually what I want my life to look like.
mhm,
Um, and so then it was just a matter of, um, saying, well, no, I don't want to climb that corporate ladder. And I still
yeah,
worked in sort of management positions, and then sort of senior and principal sort of consulting positions. And I was quite happy with that.
mhm,
And I can manage people and programs really well. It's just something that, um, you know, it's not something that I particularly want to do if I don't have to do it. I'm more interested, as I said before, in that. what's the interface between theory and policy and practice, and how do things work, and you might have an idea, let's try it out.
Mhm.
So it's that whole notion of adaptive management, and you try it out and you see what works and you see what doesn't work, and then you readjust. So um, yeah, I don't know, it was probably a strong sense of dissatisfaction and other negative sort of emotions that was just like, yeah, that's where I want to go. That's what I want to do.
Mhm. So at that point, if you don't mind me asking, at that point, you mentioned you have 2 sons.
Mm.
Did you have kids at that point, or, were they not in the picture yet?
Um, so probably a couple of years after I came back and I'd started doing a master's in landscape architecture, they arrived. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, the reason
yeah.
I'm asking is because I wonder too for like if you had been at that crossroads and you had, maybe one or both of your children at that point, do you think that, it would have been you would have had a different I guess you would have maybe taken a different path, you would have just continued on that road, or do you think you still would have switched out of that kind of corporate life?
I think I still would have switched.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
yeah.
the
No,
reason I yeah, the reason I ask
mm,
is because I think, it could just be, I don't know if it's just a cultural difference and stuff, but here, people are tend to be very nervous and very, like, just overthink everything when it comes to this. And I think that's why a lot of people do end up in these kind of dead end jobs that they don't love. And so that's why I was asking, if maybe if your children were in the picture at that point, if it could have changed your mind, because I think, like, I want to know like what it takes to have that kind of courage and courage in your passions.
mm,
And you did mention kind
mm,
of before, how your background and your story and all that stuff and your family, all kind of created that sense. But I'm wondering if, let's say, somebody came to you today and they were at that same crossroads, and they're like, I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. Like, I know what I want to do, but
mm,
I also have, kids to feed and I have this and that. And I'm just so scared of leaving what I know to be certain. What,
yeah.
what advice like would you give that person?
Look, it's certainly difficult, and while I went to study full time, our boys came a bit unexpectedly. So I ended up going back and working full time,
Mm,
um, managing programs for the Victorian EPA, and then I went and worked in consulting. Um, and the first position was sort of managerial, but then the ones after that um, were not. They were more sort of senior policy and consulting sort of positions. But that was a conscious decision, and that was partly because also of my family upbringing. I didn't see a great deal of my father,
mhm.
um, and so I guess, well, that was a fairly conscious thing that I wanted to spend a lot more time, with
Yeah.
my boys, and it's actually inform the decisions, in terms of positions that I've taken down the track, that I've sort of um, de-promoted myself over time, particularly when my
Mm,
boys went to school, because I wanted to be around. Um,
mm,
and so for me, that was a conscious decision. Look, there's obviously economic sort of things that um, will influence what and how you'll do. Whether you've got a supportive partner or not, those sorts of things. But it's also about, you know, um, well, I've continued to learn and to, I guess, skill myself up,
mhm,
recognizing that it's a long game. So unless, there's an opportunity that comes up, um, that's exactly what you want, then often it's about, well, I knew I wanted to change career. I knew I wanted to be a landscape architect. I did probably two-thirds of it before kids came along. It then took me another 4 or 5 years to finish it part-time,
mhm,
so that I could then transition. more seamlessly rather than just sort of throwing everything out and starting again, because that wasn't really an option because, like I had kids. So, um, and that's always the balance of, well, the individual freedom that I had before and the flexibility just to go, well, you know what, I don't want to do that. I want to go,
Mhm.
over to the US and try my luck there, or Canada or whatever, unless, something really concrete lines up.
Mhm.
You just, well, it's very hard, I think, to be able to do that. So part of it is, yeah, having clarity about what you wanna do, and then just taking little steps,
Mhm.
continually, moving forward. So, like I said, it took me 6 or 7 years to finish my masters. Um, the last bit of it was working full time with young kids, and then just doing a subject semester. But that was also really important, given that it was a busy point of time for you to do something passionate and something that I was
Yeah.
interested in. So, even though it was hard work, I was always, um, learning new things and learning about things that I was interested in. So, in some ways, even though it was causing stress, it was also a bit of stress relief.
Yeah, yeah. No, I
It
think
does,
it's
yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's very important. You're not the first person who has brought this up, so it's definitely been a trend that, you just kinda gotta take those baby steps. Just ta do it a little bit at a time, and I think that that's, again, very important to remember for people who are trying to do something that they are interested in, because and I've mentioned it before and with other guests that, um, I get the impression that a lot of times people do kind of want it to happen fast, like, okay, I decided that I do want to go for my dreams or whatever. I know it's going to take work, but I'm ready for it. But like in the back of their mind, I feel like a lot of times, you want things to happen quickly. It's very hard to be patient. So it's good to know from you and from other people I've spoken to that it does take time and it doesn't happen overnight, and you can still progress towards your goals, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Like you said, learning,
Mm,
learning, still learning about your passions and stuff. Even though you were also doing other things along the way and taking care of your children as well. Um,
mm.
but but yeah, so if we could shift into kind of your, I guess your current day to day, like what is a day in the life of Ross, the landscape architect now?
Um, so during the week, um, it's sort of a mix of, academic and consulting sort of work. Uh,
Mhm,
so I'd say probably the main characteristic is, well, a fair bit of, thinking strategic and sort of writing sort of stuff.
mhm,
Um, so generally, in the mornings, I'll, do more of the hardcore sort of thinking things. I'm lucky I live, pretty close to, the river, so, sort of around lunchtime or when I'm starting to lose mental, capacity, then I'll take the dog for a walk around the river. Um,
mm,
the older I get, the more, or the less I sort of work, in terms of,
mhm,
I've realised that, early on I'd be working 12, 10, 12, sometimes 14, 16-hour days. And, you can do that for a period of time, but you just get burnt out. And I guess I've learnt that, probably 8 to 9 hours a day max is, the best for me, but also being, um, well, for me, being smarter about how I do it. So I recognise that there's only so much that I can do. If I've
yeah,
sat down and I've given it a good effort, then what comes out is what comes out. So I'm far less worried about that sort of stuff than what I
mhm,
used to be.
yeah,
But, also recognizing that you need the balance and you need the rest. And for
yeah,
me, the physical exercise is really important. Like, I just know, um, that if I've been out for a walk, and I used to run a lot, um, and it was that same sort of thing. It was, sort of meditative and,
yeah,
really good sort of stress relief. And when I don't have that sort of stuff and I don't take the breaks, then, I can do it for a short time, but then over the longer term, I just don't operate best, you know.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, either it's that, and, so I normally sort of work for 45 minutes, and then I'll go out in the garden and do some weeding, or sit down and pat the dog, or, do other sorts of things. So it just gives me the opportunity um, to reset, particularly because I'm doing a lot of thinking sort of work that, I just find that after about three-quarters of an hour, my productivity, sort of decreases. And I mean, it's not always hard and fast. Sometimes you just be in a zone where,
Mhm.
it's a flow. So, I try to make the most of that. But if
Yeah.
it's not working, then it's just sort of like, rather than just try and push through, which is what I used to do,
Yeah.
now it's sort of like, okay, now's not the time to push through. Take a step back, go out and have a break. And
Mhm.
it's particularly when I was writing a PhD, because the final part of that was in COVID, and you
Mm.
may or may not know that Melbourne and Geelong had, the longest lockdowns in the world. So it was
Wow.
basically 18 months of being locked down, and at certain periods of time, the maximum that you could go outside was, and exercise was an hour a day, and you could go 5 kilometres from maximum of 5 kilometres, from home. And so
Oh my
I
gosh.
was spending a lot of the time sort of writing
Mm.
and trying to finish a PhD, and you'd just get to a point where it was just a roadblock, or there was just so much going on in your mind that
Yeah.
you just weren't able to write. And even just an hour of walking, you'd walk, wouldn't have headphones or anything else like that in, and then by the time that I'd got back, either through thinking or just having that space,
Mhm.
you'd resolve whatever the issue was. So that's
Yeah.
been um, that's been a really big learning for me, and I guess how I structure my day to day sort of stuff. I also try and have weekends off. So unless
Mhm.
there's a really compelling need, um, I don't like working on weekends, and part of that's just to make sure that I've got that I'm refreshed, and then when I come back Monday, then I'll sit down and then I can you know do whatever I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very important, it again brings up, kind of the buzzword, work-life balance and stuff like that, and it seems like you've kind of figured it out, and you and a lot of other guests have, I guess, have mentioned that being out in nature and going for walks and stuff like that, are a big part of their day. So it seems to again be another pattern,
Mm,
that it's just something that we all kind of need. But you mentioned your writing and stuff, and so that brings me to one thing. So I found some of your papers, and so there's one. They all sound very interesting, but there's one that I was wondering maybe if you could chat a little bit about. Like the ideas behind it. It's the one. It says recrafting urban climate change resilience understandings, learning from Australian Indigenous cultures. That sounds very
mm.
interesting to me, and I'm wondering what kind of insights you took from Indigenous cultures on creating, the sustainable environments.
Yeah, sure. Um, well, I guess one of the reasons for doing the PhD, was trying to understand how you can improve the sustainability and the environmental health, of cities, because they're one of the major causes for the environmental condition that we find ourselves in. And when I started to do my PhD, I was looking at, um, well, I probably need to go back a step. So when I was in Water Watch that I was talking about before, we could get school kids in urban areas engaged. We could get rural adults, farmers engaged. We just couldn't get urban adults engaged in Water Watch activities. Like, it was just a tiny proportion. And because I was working in the environment field, I was always wondering, well, why is that? And then when I was studying a master's, um, I did a subject on landscape heritage, and my street has a heritage overlay on it, and my front yard has a front garden has a heritage overlay on it. So I really wanted to understand what that was, and so I became interested in backyards.
Mm.
And basically, it, through, I guess, the process of thinking over a number of years, it occurred to me that where most people undertake most of their environmental care activities is in their backyards.
Mhm.
And so, backyards or residential areas account for about 70% of Melbourne and Geelong. So, it's individual landowners that, on an individual basis don't really have much of an impact. But when you bring it all together, it has a really big impact.
Mhm.
And so there's those sorts of things on one hand. And then in Australia, there's two dominant worldviews that I guess are inscribed in the landscape. There's that of Aboriginal Australia. And, so depending on who you speak to, it's at least 65,000 years of presence. It's some are saying it's probably over 120,000 years of presence of
Mm.
where they've actively designed and curated the landscape. So you've got that, and then you've got the Western, I guess, worldview, which initially came from the UK, but then certainly over the 20th century, more and more came from America. And so that's influenced the design of our cities and the design of our suburbs. So that's the physical form. And so in my mind, I was trying to work out, well, if Aboriginal Australians have lived on the continent for at least 60,000 years, they lived really sustainable sort of lives. Early settler accounts of Aboriginal people and the landscape was that it was extraordinarily healthy, much healthier than people who came from the UK. Well,
Mhm.
what can you learn from that? Given that on the surface it appears that, and there's this myth that Aboriginal people were nomads; they didn't have houses, versus in non-Aboriginal Australian society, we live in the one house. So a lot of it was then saying, well, how do I actually understand how Aboriginal people designed and conceived of landscape? And the more and more I sort of got into it, the more obvious it became that there were actually cities and villages and
Mm.
neighbourhoods. Like again, the early sort of settler accounts all talk about hamlets, neighbourhoods, villages, towns, and then within a year or two, all of that reference got removed because
Mm.
the political view was that Australia was terra nullius, so no one lived here, and that was the basis on
Mm.
which Britain, basically took all the land. So it was then saying, well, there seems to be two diametrically opposed, worldviews. There's that of Aboriginal Australia, which created a sustainable society, and then there's the Western approach, which is largely not sustainable. How do you
Yeah.
get them to work together? And then
Mm.
so it was really about, well, rather than looking at the differences, take it up a step and start to look at the areas of commonality. And so, we all need food, we all need water, we all need somewhere to live. So Maslow's hierarchy sorts of stuff. So it was then a matter of saying, well, or getting an understanding of how Aboriginal people around Geelong, or Geelong is the Wadawurrung name, how they designed their urban settlements, how they lived, and then what can we actually learn from that. So working with nature
Mm.
to redesign Western generated suburbs, given that there's 25 million people in Australia. We can't just bulldoze it all and start again, partly because
Yeah.
it's actually far more environmentally damaging. But
Mhm.
how can you retrofit it?
Mhm.
And then so some of the writings that I was doing, I don't know, probably a decade or so ago, was me trying to get my head around that sort of stuff as a non-Aboriginal person. Because then
Mhm.
there's also this thing of, well, um, Aboriginal people, firstly their land and then their art and their
Yeah.
ideas have been, I guess, taken over by non-Aboriginal people. So there's this, sort of sensitivity of, well, I want to understand it in
Mhm.
terms of me getting a better understanding of sense of place and how we might design landscapes in the future. But I also want it to be, respectful and to be an act of reconciliation. And so at that time, I was working as an open space planner for Surf Coast Shire, which is, I don't know if you know much about this part of Australia, but it's the start of the Great Ocean Road, which is one of um, the best sort of coastal drives
Mm.
in the world. And it's also, if you're interested in surfing or know about surfing, it's where Bells Beach. So the first professional surfing competition is in
Cool.
Torquay. Um, and because I'd long had a history in Aboriginal sorts of aspects, and I was dealing with land management, and used to work with elders from the Wadawurrung, so the traditional owners, and the chair of the Wadawurrung registered Aboriginal Party, a man called Uncle Brian Powell. We struck up a really good relationship, and I remember, talking with him about this one day and just saying, look, as a non-Aboriginal landscape architect, I'm interested in how can I learn from
Mm.
Aboriginal approaches in a respectful way that's not appropriation.
Yeah.
And he said, a lot of it all comes down to intent, but as like you're Australian, and so part of your history is Aboriginal history, and you need
Mm.
to understand Aboriginal history. And but when I was, trying to pull together stuff from a PhD, there just weren't any writings on that sort of stuff. It was either
Mm.
Aboriginal stuff, and a lot of the Aboriginal stuff was written by non-Aboriginal people.
Oh.
And it was only,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's only really been the last decade and a half or so, that Aboriginal academics or Aboriginal public intellectuals are starting to write about their perspectives. But
Yeah.
then it was the thing of, well, you've got the Aboriginal and you've got the non-Aboriginal. How do you bring them together?
Yeah.
Um, and so a lot of my writings was trying to do that. And then there was an Aboriginal journalist, well-known journalist called Stan Grant, um, who was writing about how he felt he fitted in Australian society, given that he had one parent was Aboriginal and one parent was non-Aboriginal. So he sort of straddled both worlds, and you know looked Aboriginal but not Aboriginal enough for
Mm.
for Aboriginal society, or for
Mm.
some members of Aboriginal society, and then sort of white but not white enough
Mm.
for non-Aboriginal society. And so he was talking about this concept of the Creole garden, and of a both ways sort of an approach that echoes what I was talking about before of, well, if we sort of take a step up above the details of how you might achieve something, how you might procure food, or what sort of food that you choose to eat. Well, we all need food. And so let's have a look at the similarities and work from that thing of similarities and something that's has Aboriginal elements and non-Aboriginal elements. And in the Australian context, certainly since World War II, it's not just Aboriginal and British sort of influences. There are, comments that we're the most multicultural country in the world. So you've got lots of um, other European influences, and then lots of Asian, and increasing in the past sort of few decades, African
Mhm.
sort of thing. So how do you bring all those different sorts of conceptions and understandings of landscape together in a way that you actually care for country, to use Aboriginal sorts of terms? So yeah, that was where those writings were sort of coming from. And you sort of look back on it now, and well, in some ways, you sort of think, oh, it's a bit clumsy, but it's also coming back to Uncle Brian Powell and some other sort of more recent um, academic works with there's now that recognition of, well, we've now got a stronger sense of Aboriginal understandings of country from an Aboriginal perspective,
Mhm.
which replace or build on the non-Aboriginal ones. But how do you actually now bring them together to have something that's Australian? And part of that's recognised by Aboriginal architects and landscape architects and academics, in that, the last decade or so, there's been a much stronger awakening within the built environment professions that we need to reconcile with Aboriginal understandings and approaches for a whole variety of reasons. But,
Mhm.
there's something like, I think there's 5 practicing Aboriginal architects in Australia. So, and, there's now legislative requirements in various states that say that you need to talk to traditional owners. And there's so many projects that happen.
Mhm.
And if you've only got 5 Aboriginal architects, there's not the capacity to do that. So, there's now the recognition that non-Aboriginal people need to have um, a greater role in that. But again, it's that respect. And so, how do you, one, provide conceptions that are very different to Western conceptions,
Mhm.
uh, in ways that are easily sort of accessible to non-Aboriginal sort of people? And how do you provide the right processes so that it's inclusive and it reconciles a lot of the damage that's been done and helps you step forward in a positive way? So I sort of feel like I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but that was the journey of, well, firstly, how do I get my head around it so that
Yeah.
I can start to design landscapes in much more respectful and sustainable ways. But it's also mirroring um, a general sort of approach, particularly within the built environment professions of, we've got these 2 dominant worldviews, um, and, Aboriginal authors, like Bruce Pascoe, sort of talk about, well, there's a couple of realities. Aboriginal people aren't going to go away, and non-Aboriginal people aren't going to go away. So,
Mhm.
in that situation, how do you work together, and how do you actually care for country, which is a really nice, notion from an environmental perspective of, well, we actually need the environment to survive. It's not the other way around. Like, if people weren't on the planet, um, Earth would find its own equilibrium pretty quickly. But we don't have a healthy planet. We're not,
Mhm.
we're not going to be sticking around for too long.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is it's the kind of thing that, over here, it's the same sort of thing. Like, people are kind of finally, I think, really thinking about this. Now, of course, there's been landscape architects and people in the field of sustainability for a good amount of time over here as well. But I feel like now, over like the last decade, people are really mindful of it. Like, the general populace is really mindful of it. I mean, I mentioned before we started recording that I taught for a little bit, and during that time, it was interesting. Like, a lot of the kids were writing essays about what they wanted to do when they grew up, and it wasn't like astronauts or veterinarians or things like from when I was a kid. It was I want to help the environment. I want to make the earth healthy. Stuff like that is what the kids would write, and it's
Mm,
interesting. It speaks to how I guess the mindset is definitely shifting more towards, like you said, we don't, we need the environment to be healthy. The environment does not need us, like you said.
mm.
It'll be fine, probably a thousand times better, if we weren't here. But it does bring to mind. Do you have any projects that you worked on, like broke ground on, I suppose, that you got to actually implement? This idea of working with the Aboriginal kind of culture and stuff. Do you have any projects you got to actually work on physically, or were these all kind of just concepts at the moment?
Um, it's a bit of both. Like, so when I was talking about working for Bowen Water
Yeah.
from the early 90s, um, I was actually really fortunate that my first manager um, had a really strong interest in, I guess, working with Aboriginal communities. So
Mm.
a number of the landscapes that we actually created had a really strong involvement with Aboriginal
Nice.
communities in terms of the ideas and the concepts, and I guess what's commonly termed over here co-design. Like, I look back on it now in some of these landscapes, and um, they were innovative by 20, 25 years. And
Mm.
another one of them was actually building a wetland, um, or reclaiming it,
Mhm.
and using Aboriginal sorts of understanding of seasonality in that sort of stuff. But there
Mhm.
wasn't really a great deal of information at the time that was around to do it. And that project was really an anomaly, and really a function of, in those days, waterway management bodies had the ability to do that. And we used to, have rates that were specifically allocated to it. And you had a lot more flexibility. You didn't
Mm.
have to jump through so many hoops to get it done. Um, and so, I did that, and then as I was saying before, I sort of went off more into management. But I remember when I was in Waterwatch South Australia, and I got this phone message from an Aboriginal elder who um, was from the remote areas, and a lot of the Aboriginal youth from those areas had diabetes problems, and it was because all they were doing was drinking Coke
Mm.
and drinking soft drink. And the reason that they were doing that was where they lived doesn't have much surface water. A lot of it's groundwater, is
Mm.
groundwater.
Yeah.
They need groundwater, and the groundwater was just really salty. So, if you couldn't get clean water, then, they went to other sorts of things. And so this would have been maybe 2000. He wanted to explore a both ways approach to what I was talking about before, of how can you use Western science, so things like meters to test salinity, and to test nutrients of groundwater and that sort of stuff, with traditional Aboriginal sources of knowledge of reading country, because it's a lot different now, but certainly in those periods of time, a lot of Aboriginal communities, a lot of the young people were moving into cities, and also
Mm.
because there was less of an interest in embracing Aboriginal culture. And so this older was concerned that a lot of the stories, a lot of the song lines, a lot of the cultural understanding of land management was being lost
Yeah.
in the current generations. And so anyway, I got this message when I was overseas, and I came back, and then rang him up. And between when he'd left the message and when I'd made the call, he'd passed away, unfortunately.
Oh my goodness.
And like, I just look back now and just think, or even at the time, it was just a really strong feeling of regret,
Mm.
that this was a really excellent opportunity to do something that, well, I was really interested in, but also started to, I guess, close the gap between Aboriginal society and non-Aboriginal society. But then it sort of, I did, a little bit of work on doing cultural heritage management plans on construction projects, and that was really good.
Mhm.
So that was, making sure that, if we're putting through new railway lines or things like that, that we avoided damage to Aboriginal heritage as much as we could, which was really good. And then, as I was sort of saying before, when I worked for Surf Coast Shire, one of my roles was to embed Aboriginal values into the future management of Bells Beach Surfing Recreation Reserve. Um, but in terms of, I guess, design, the most recent one is a project that I was doing with Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, where that hospital is basically surrounded by hardscape. So there's very few trees. There's very little soft surface. And the CEO at the time was really interested in one, how they could make that site far less hostile. So
Mhm.
introducing a lot of vegetation and mitigating heat and all that sort of stuff. But also, and more importantly, how they could engage with the Aboriginal history of the site, given that there were specific units focused on Aboriginal health. And so that was a really nice exercise in terms of involving Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, from the beginning in terms of working up the project and having that code led design of
Mhm.
both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal approaches to understanding the landscape, um, to use of the landscape, um, and then also to the design and the construction of it. So
Mm.
yeah, they're probably, well, that's a bit of a potted history of involvement in those sorts of aspects.
That's it's very interesting, it's very interesting. So kind of shifting back to, I guess, passions and interests and stuff. I'm wondering, of course we know you are very passionate about nature and all that stuff, but I'm wondering, do you feel like this path that you've been on, do you feel like going into, sustainable landscape architecture and doing these designs and, what you do now, and you said it's a lot of thinking and writing and stuff. Do you feel like all of this is your purpose in life, or do you separate purpose from passion?
Um, yeah, no, I think they're very, very much entwined, and I think that you need to have passion to. Well, you don't necessarily need passion to deliver the purpose, but I do.
Mhm.
And different people operate with different sort of motivations and drivers and those sorts of things. Um, Yeah, I'd say that it probably is my purpose in life. And like I was saying, at the beginning, when I sort of look at my ancestry and when I've
Yeah.
traveled the places where ancestors have come from, that have been for a long period of time, I've felt a really strong connection with, like it's in your bones.
Yeah.
And then, like I was saying, the more and more I look, particularly at my mother's father's side of the family, there's a long history of people who will not only um, engaged in horticulture. But the other side of it was that they're also involved in fashion design. So my mother, and I didn't find this out um, until her funeral. She designed dresses and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
and she was always passionate about it and interested in it. But I didn't know that she actually worked in high end boutiques in Collins Street in Melbourne. So there's in
Mhm.
Collins Street, which is, trying to think what the equivalent would be in New York. Um, it's almost like Fifth Avenue. It's where all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the um, boutique stores are. She worked in those stores
Oh.
before she moved down to Geelong, and I never knew.
Mm.
And that's just the way that it sort of is. And then my father's family were tailors, so there's two elements, I guess, that are through my history.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, there's the design bit,
Mhm.
um, and then there's the practical sort of bit, and
Yeah.
so that's the thing that I've worked in the environment, and some have been more built than others, and some have been more natural than others. But I've always been interested in, and my career's sort of shown it that I'll do some academic stuff for a while to try and get my head around, well, how does this conceptually work? And
Mhm.
then when I think that I've got an understanding of how it conceptually works, well, I then want to go and try it. And
Yeah.
then when I've tried it, then I want to evaluate it. I want to understand how and why it works or it doesn't work. And then how does it then fly back into into the theory? So it's that iterative and ongoing sort of evolutionary sort of an approach.
Mhm.
Um, So I guess that's really what's driven my purpose and my passion is those,
Mhm.
2 sorts of things, and I think part of it is, um, having the time to be able to listen to it, and also, finding, what it is. Like, it's interesting, I've got twin boys, and they're well, one of them's just finished his high school, and doesn't really know what he wants to do, and then the other's doing his exams right now, and as it turns out, um, he wants to be an architect or a landscape architect, and that hasn't
Ah.
been through any sort of, given what I was saying before, I
Yeah,
was always really clear of you find your own paths,
yeah,
and the one that, doesn't know what he really wants to do, sometimes he sort of thinks that, "Oh, well, maybe he should," and it's just like, "No, you go and do what you need and follow what you're interested in."
yeah,
And, you know, and some ways it sort of comes to you, but there's also not, you know, there's not a timeline, and in somewhat like I look back at my career, and a lot of the opportunities, particularly in the first half of it, were organic. Like, like at a broad level, I knew what I wanted to do,
mhm,
but I wasn't, I never intended to work at Barn Water.
yeah,
That was just um, through a friend who was offered an opportunity there, who was studying at Burnley. He was a couple of years behind me. He couldn't do it. So I said, "Oh, well, do you want to come down and work?" And I was in my final semester. And so I worked there, and then got, like when I was doing that was when Australia was in a recession. So this is the early 90s. So I wasn't expecting to get work. I was actually thinking, well, I'll go overseas. And then I was offered full time work. And
mm,
so it was like, oh, well, rather than the break that I was hanging out for, like I look back at it now, and, like it was the perfect job
yeah,
at that particular time. Like, I got to revegetate, the Barwon River, with
mm,
indigenous sort of plants and new sorts
yeah,
of ways of thinking that I wouldn't have got anywhere else. Um, but um, I guess the lesson that I've learnt from that, and I'd sort of explained to you before that, I was then ready to go overseas again, and then I got another opportunity, and, on reflection, I probably wouldn't have done that again. And there was part of me that sort of said, "Well, no, no, you just need a break." And in
yeah,
some ways, I was sort of doing it for other people. And I
mhm,
think that that's, not just family, but, people who I work with professionally said, "Oh, it's a really good opportunity," and, and blah, blah, blah. But now I would have taken that break, um,
yeah,
to get that clarity, even
mhm,
5 years sort of earlier. But, like, it's a they're also learnings too, in that, it ultimately meant that I had a pretty clear understanding of what I did and didn't wanna do work-wise.
mhm,
And it's also, I think, one of the things in my career is that, um, that I've worked as an on-ground practitioner. I've worked in policy and program management. I've worked as a construction environment manager. I've worked in open space planning, in academia and consulting. So I think one of the things that over 30 years that gives me is a really good understanding of how the industry works. Um,
yeah,
so, it's a mixture of, one, listening to what you really wanna do, and I know, even, with my kids, it's okay to fail, it's okay to fail, try things, find
yeah,
what you wanna do, um, try different things. There's different ways that you can reach the same outcome. Um,
mm,
but, it's ultimately the journey.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting because I feel like, you've mentioned now that, it's okay to fail and all that stuff. But also when you mentioned that things kind of sort of unfolded a little bit for you, like, you got these opportunities, and sometimes it can make one wonder, like, what if you didn't go for that opportunity? Is it like, then it's the end, because I think people sometimes are trying to look for those moments in time where they're like, "Okay, wait, this is it. This is the turning point. I got it. This is me getting my foot in the door," all that stuff. If I miss an opportunity like this, you know, one might not come around again. But it seems like, from speaking to you and speaking to other people, that that's not really the case. And I think people have kind of a like maybe a, I don't know, an incorrect vision of that, because you even mentioned, it's okay if you go forward with something and it doesn't work out, or like you mentioned with your own life, now you would have maybe not taken that other job and you would have taken a break and stuff, but it worked out anyway.
Mm,
So like you said, there's lessons in everything that you do anyway. So I think that's reassuring, definitely. And to mention, I guess, support. You seem like you're obviously very supportive of your children, and you tell them, it's okay to fail, like you said, and just follow your interests to the child who you said he doesn't really exactly know what he wants to do yet and stuff. And it can definitely feel this, like, he probably feels this like sense of heaviness and, like, kind of just confusion. I know I've definitely felt it.
mm,
Um, but speaking of support, so obviously you're very supportive of your own children. I'm wondering, are there any people in your own life who kind of were that support system,
mm,
or was it kind of just a lot within yourself and a lot within just your own personal history and what you saw happening with your father, let's say?
mm. Oh, look, particularly early on, the first decade or so of my career. So I mentioned my first boss at Bowen Water, who, I often think have big ideas and um, want to try and do the best that I can and to be innovative. And he enabled me to do it. So I got to all these ideas that I picked up from James Hitchmore at Burnley. Really cutting edge sort of ideas.
Mhm.
I could then go and implement. And um, you know that boss, Peter Burns, was incredibly supportive. So um, yeah, really lucky to be able to go and do that. And then when I went to South Australia, um, the chair of the committee that oversaw Waterwatch South Australia was originally a horticulturalist. He came from Ireland, and he was the CEO of Adelaide Zoo. And
Mm.
so I was the executive officer for the committee. And so I used to wander down to the zoo, every couple of weeks or every month or so. And, you'd walk into this big, beautiful old Victorian building, beautiful timbers, and Ed would, sit behind this big sort of desk. And he took, almost a fatherly sort of role in terms of, because I was really young, as I was saying
Mhm.
before, and it was a challenging position. And we talked about, well, how do we navigate Waterwatch and how do we manage it, but then also just broader life experiences and life skills. And his leadership style was, some people would say it's paternal, but it's the intent that's the
Mhm.
important thing. That's the important thing. And so, he would give me his perspectives on his experience, and but would also seek mine, and was really altruistic
Mm.
in his guidance. And now that I'm sort of getting towards the tail end, the last sort of third of my career, I've been mentoring, design students from Melbourne School of Design. Well, I haven't done it for a couple of years, but did it for a couple of years before that, and now chairing some committees at the state level and that sort of stuff. And um, I see it as my sort of opportunity to give back
Mm.
and to help, the next generation of landscape architects in this case.
Yeah.
Um, excuse me, to find their way into and to navigate. And even I've been doing some tutoring in some urban and landscape history subjects, and some landscape history subjects last year. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy, that you've got young people at the start of their academic careers, so the young adults, and they're really keen to learn
Mhm.
and to understand. And I'm quite keen to find, different sort of perspectives, and contemporary sort of perspectives from their end, but then also, and often you'll be asked, particularly at the end of, semester, for advice, or, what did I do in my career and what did I find, and blah, blah, blah. And it is nice to share those sort of experiences, and people can take them on board, how they see fit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very important. I feel like sometimes having those people along the way, like what you're doing now, you mentioned, that you try to mentor students and stuff and young adults. Like it's just so important because, not everybody has maybe family members or friends who are supportive in that way. So having these other folks out there who want to, help to kind of guide people down these pathways is very important. And I don't want to say that it's hard to come by. I would say that in my own experiences, it is a bit hard to come by. I think
Mm,
sometimes people get in their own kind of mind, and they're like, why would I do extra work? Why do I care about other people? But it just is a reminder that sometimes that could be what makes or breaks somebody's
yeah.
future too. So it's definitely so important. Um, so I'm wondering too, looking back at your whole career up to this point, is there a moment or a project or anything that you feel like most proud of?
Ooh. um,
It could just
look,
be it could just be something that you are very proud of. It doesn't have to be like the pinnacle.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, look, there's probably, a couple of things that really stand out. So, you
Mhm,
know, even though it caused me a lot of pain at times, managing water watch from the local to the national level, and being
mhm,
able to transition it from one funding cycle to the next, and to have the longevity, is something that, through the passage of time, um, yeah, I really appreciate. And the program that I actually start, so it's no longer a national program, hasn't been since, I don't know, 2009 or something like that. But the program that I started down here in Corangamite is still going really strong. It's one of the
mhm,
few that's really going strong. And so, you put all the effort in, and sometimes you
mhm.
do wonder whether it's worth it. And, like I was saying before, there are times where I sort of got burnt out, but then I see that the legacy of that is that the broader community
Yeah.
still values, and it's probably more important that there isn't the national funding available. So they
Mhm,
still value that program. They value, the lessons and the opportunities that it gives, people from all sectors of society to engage in it. And
mhm.
then the second one would be my PhD, that, it took me 10 years
Yeah.
to complete. And, when I started it, I was working full time and my boys were young. And, particularly towards the end, there was lots of pressure, particularly from academics and supervisors and the like, just to get it finished. And
Yeah.
I'd spoken to another friend who'd done his PhD 20 to 30 years ago. And then it was more just a ticket to be able to practice as an academic. And he did that. He was told, just finish it, just get it done, and he regretted it.
Ah,
And so, even though it took a bit longer,
yeah.
uh, you know, having that sort of persistence and resilience towards it, like, I'm incredibly satisfied with that PhD.
Yeah.
Like, other people may or may not think it's good, or whatever, but it answered the questions that I wanted to ask.
Mhm.
I did it in the way that I wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And, um, there is that satisfaction. And I guess that sort of comes back to some of the things that were talking before about, well, how long do you persist for, or do you, so what opportunities do you take? And I guess part of it is, I guess, wisdom over time, of
Mhm.
sometimes the opportunities aren't right. And so
Mm,
part of that's then, well, it might be a really good opportunity. So why are you actually doing it? Are you ready for it? Is it
mm,
a good organisation? Does it have a good culture? is there going to
Mhm.
be support? And I guess I've learned over time, I'm much more in tune to that sort of now, just of that gut feel of, well, no, it's not the right time, or yes, it is the right time. And that's
Mhm.
just unfortunately, for most people, that's something that takes decades. I sort of look at probably the most renowned Australian architect. Um, he talks about it wasn't so this guy's called Glenn Murcutt, and he has done similar sort of things to what I did, but a lot sort of earlier in terms of how do you find an Australian architecture that blends both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal sort of approaches. But he
Mhm.
was saying, look, it wasn't until his 50s that he felt that he became an architect, that he could actually design good stuff. Now, this guy's got international awards everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, has had was born to be an architect. And so for
Mm.
him to say, well, it's taken me 30 years, or,
Yeah.
there was um, another really important urban scholar called Hugh Stretton who wrote some really important books in around 1970 or from 1970 onwards. And he said, sort of flippantly that, anyone under 40 shouldn't write a book, because I'm not necessarily sure that I subscribe to that view. I think that he was talking about it from an urban design perspective, but the thing is that
Mhm.
it takes to get an understanding, and to get life experience. And I guess
Yeah.
um, it's one of the appeals, but also one of the constraints of the design professions is that its breadth
Mm.
is so expansive.
Mhm.
There's so many areas that you can work in it. Um, that it does take a bit of time to sort of work out, well, where are you located within this, and how can I actually say something that is contributing in an informed and a positive sort of way. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, there is no magic bullet.
Mhm.
Um, it just takes time, and
Yeah.
part of it is being open to the
Yeah.
experience, having that clarity of what you want to do, and actually being able to listen to yourself, to find, to give yourself the space to do it. And sometimes taking time out is ultimately, two steps forward. It might seem like a step back, but well,
Mhm.
certainly in my experience, having that time out, and that's something that's not always valued.
Mhm.
But I found that it's really important in terms, particularly when there's major decisions to make, or I'm a bit uncertain.
Yeah.
And part of it's also probably my personality being more introverted. I'll take a
Mm.
step back and go, okay, what do I really want to do? And
Mhm.
engage both, the rational and the emotional sort of
Yeah.
parts of me to find a decision that I'm comfortable with.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's pretty crucial, you saying, it does take time to not even to get to your goals, but just to kind of formulate, kind of the mindset of knowing, just having that wisdom, it does take time to have that wisdom. So sometimes you have to do the wrong thing in order to know that it was the wrong thing, I mean,
Yeah.
I've had that experience definitely in kind of like my career life, I guess, like we mentioned before that, I've had several different jobs in like different fields.
Mm.
And a couple of them I thought, for sure I'm like, oh, I'm gonna love this. And then I did it. I thought it was the right choice. And then I'm like, no, no way. Definitely don't like this. I'm like, okay, well, let me try this then. Nope, definitely don't like this. People told me that I should do this, but I don't like it, So it's interesting. You do sometimes have to take those wrong steps first, to find, to like narrow the field, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. And then you mentioned also kind of time. It makes me think of the
Mm.
last question I usually like to ask, to guests. So what are your, do you have any like important future goals that you have, like, that you want to reach? It doesn't have to necessarily be professionally. It could be
Mm.
professionally, it could be personally. Like, I had one guest who said that her goal is basically to not have goals because she was so goal oriented her whole life. And I'm like, that's fine too, So I'm wondering if you have any goals that you just want to put out there just to make it easier to kind of maybe reach for. Because sometimes when you say it, I think sometimes when you say it out loud, it makes it a little bit more helpful. So I'm wondering if there's anything like
Yeah,
that for
yeah. Um, yeah, at a broad level, I do, but not, sort of specifics. And I guess that's one of the things that the older that I get, the less specific I am about exactly what I want to do.
you. Mhm.
But at a broad level, sort of saying most of my career has been spent in government and consulting, and so what really interests me is research. So, academic sort of stuff, um, and again, continuing to put sort of well, working on theory, but putting theory into practice. And for me, a lot of that at the moment's around the interface between landscape as preventative sort of health for human health.
Mhm.
So how do you
Yeah.
use landscape to actually improve people's health as
Yeah.
well as improve environmental health? So that's the main sort of thing. So research is what I'm particularly interested in, and I'd be quite happy to spend the rest of my career doing that sort of stuff. Now that my boys are about to leave secondary school, that's obviously been the main focus for the last 18 years or so, and I'll always sort of have a role, but I'm quite looking forward to being able to spend more time on myself. And so I've got a little bit of land about a bit over an hour away in a small country town that I want to have a bit of a play with. So,
Hmm.
I've got the time to put ideas that I've had in some cases for 30 years from horticulture
Yeah.
into play. And like it's only small. It's probably only about 3 acres, but it's enough for me to try a few ideas out.
Mhm.
And yeah, and just to do lots of hiking. So I try and get out and hike, and while I'm still physically capable, do multi-day sort of over backpacks and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, they're the main things that I'm interested in, and
Mhm.
take it as it
Oh.
comes, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, awesome, awesome. I love to hear the personal goals as well, because I think a lot of times when I ask this question, guests tend to wanna just focus on, like the professional goals, but I am also
Mm.
really curious about personal goals. So, you working on the land that you have, that sounds awesome. I'm just picturing, like, I don't know if this is your goal, for that, but I'm picturing, like, one day, that becoming like, whatever you build over there and, like, and I guess, design, like it becoming a park or something like that. Like that's what I'm picturing. I don't know if that's what you want to do, but I'm like, if in like 10 years I see your name pop up and it's like this, this new like, park that kind of combines, like you said before, like the kind of Aboriginal cultures with just the built kind of environment. I'd like to see something like that. That would be interesting.
Mm.
I don't know if that's what you want to do, but I'm
Yeah.
picturing that something like that coming to fruition, and me seeing like, oh wait, this is your park. Like that's awesome. I got to visit it one day. But yeah, it doesn't have to happen. But that's my dream now to see your name on your land and like this awesome little park that we can visit. But anyway,
Yeah.
so yeah, that about wraps it up. I'm wondering before we say goodbye, do you have anything else that you'd like to mention that you think maybe we left out of this conversation?
No, no, I think it's covered a fair bit of ground, which is good.
Mhm.
So thanks for the opportunity to have a chat, and
Yeah, no, thank you so
yeah, good
much
luck.
as well. Yeah, it's been
Good
a
luck
it's
on
been
your
an awesome
journey. Yeah.
conversation. Thank you, and I hope that I hope you enjoy the rest of your day because oh my gosh, I forgot to say happy Halloween. I don't know if that's a thing as much over there as it
Yeah.
is over here.
Um, oh, certainly, in the last couple of decades, it's become much more popular, and
Yeah.
yeah, my neighbours have got cobwebs all over their fence. So um, Yes, I'm expecting a barrage later today.
Yeah, so good luck with that. Um, ours is gonna come in tomorrow for us, and I don't
Mm,
know. It's what time is it here? It's 6:42 here, so we still have a bit of time to get candy and all that stuff for the trick or treaters. But I hope that you have a wonderful day. And again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your morning to chat with me.
yeah, my pleasure.
Bye.